The message was brief. Rod Stewart did not dress it up, and perhaps that is why it landed so heavily. He had lost Don. Then, only weeks later, Bob was gone too. Two older brothers, two men who had existed in his life before almost everything people associate with him, gone within 2 months. He called them his best mates, irreplaceable. There was no long interview attached, no careful explanation of grief, just those words, and then the names. That is where this story begins. Not with Rod Stewart at 81, and not with the version preserved in old photographs. It begins with a man in his late 70s suddenly becoming the youngest brother again. Rod was the last of 5 children: Don, Bob, Peggy, Mary, then Rod, born years after the others. In a family like that, the youngest occupies a peculiar place. Everyone remembers things you do not. They know the parents before age softened them. They carry stories about you that you may not remember living. Older brothers do something else. They hold an earlier version of you. Don and Bob knew Roderick before strangers developed opinions about his clothes, relationships, and decisions. To them, he could still be the younger brother who followed along, argued, borrowed things, got teased, and was forgiven. That kind of relationship does not need to be rebuilt at every meeting. It simply resumes, until it cannot. Don died in September 2022. Bob died that November. The first loss had barely settled before another arrived. Grief had no chance to become orderly. One brother's funeral belonged beside plans for another. One set of memories opened the door to the next. You may know that feeling. Someone dies, and for a few days you are mourning one person. Then you realize you are also mourning the room they came from, the family arrangement that existed when they were alive, the way everyone once stood in relation to everyone else. Rod still had his sisters. He still had a large family of his own. Yet Don and Bob belonged to the first household, the one that existed before he could choose anything about himself. That matters because Rod has often spoken most easily through humor. He can turn discomfort into a joke before a room has decided whether it is allowed to laugh. Part charm, perhaps part protection, but there was little humor in the words he chose for his brothers. Best mates, irreplaceable buddies, almost plain, almost boyish. Maybe that plainness is the closest he comes to saying what the loss did. These were not distant relatives whose names appeared mainly on holiday cards. His brothers supported him before music looked like a safe future. They belonged to the small group who had seen uncertainty before success made everything seem inevitable. When people like that disappear, later praise cannot replace what they knew. They knew the doubt. They knew the beginning. They knew the family without needing the story retold. Rod's honesty about his life has not arrived as one dramatic confession. It has come in fragments: a sentence about a brother, an admission about a marriage, an uncomfortable truth about a daughter, comments about apologies and family. Put together, those fragments form a different account of him, less tidy, more difficult. The deaths of Don and Bob did not create every regret that followed, but they placed old absences beside one another. A family loss can do that. It can pull an older silence forward, not because the stories are identical, but because absence begins recognizing absence. Because once the people who remember your childhood begin to disappear, another question can surface. Who remembers the childhood you missed in someone else's life? For Rod Stewart, that question had a name: Sarah. Rod once said something about his eldest daughter that most famous fathers would probably avoid saying in public. He said he had never truly felt like her father. Not because he denied that Sarah was his child. The reason was more ordinary and therefore more painful. He had not taken her to school. He had not changed her nappies. He had not been present for the repeated acts from which parenthood is usually built. So, he said, the paternal feeling had not simply appeared. There is an honesty in that admission that does not make anyone look heroic. Sarah was born when Rod was still a teenager and had almost no money. Her mother, Susanna Boffey, was also young. The child spent years in foster care and children's homes before being adopted at 5. By then, Rod's life had begun moving elsewhere: music, work, travel. The uncertain climb toward a future nobody could guarantee. Years later, Sarah learned who her biological father was. Imagine receiving that information as a young woman. Not only that your father was alive, but that his face was already familiar to people who had never met him. The relationship did not immediately become close. They met, lost contact, tried again. There were long gaps, the kind of gaps that cannot be repaired by one emotional meeting. When Sarah's adoptive parents died, she and Rod began trying to build something more consistent. Even his language was cautious. They were trying to come together. It was working fairly well. He was trying. Trying is not a cinematic word. It promises no perfect reunion. And perhaps that is why it feels true. A father meeting an adult daughter does not begin at the beginning. He meets her after other people have soothed her childhood fears, attended school events, corrected her, encouraged her, disappointed her, loved her. He may bring affection and regret, but he enters a story that already has a history without him. Sarah later said their relationship had evolved slowly. At first, his public identity made everything more complicated. He was not simply the man connected to her birth. He was Rod Stewart. Other people already possessed memories of him. She had to discover where Dad could exist inside that. Eventually, she said, things became more relaxed. He became Dad to her. That sentence is hopeful, but not simple. Now he's just Dad. Sounds like an arrival. Yet what came before remains there. Adoption, foster care, confusion, decades in which both people lived separate lives. The parents who raised Sarah and later died. Rod's other children, born into completely different versions of his adulthood. It would be easy to turn this into redemption. He made a mistake, returned, and everything healed. Families rarely cooperate with that kind of writing. Rod was young and broke. That matters. Sarah was a child without him. That matters too. One fact does not cancel the other. Understanding the circumstances is not the same as recovering the missing years. There is something revealing in the detail Rod chose when explaining why fatherhood felt unfamiliar. He did not mention money. He mentioned school and nappies, mundane acts, repeated acts. The things that never become headlines because almost every parent does them when no one is watching. Perhaps he had learned that being related to someone and having a relationship with them are not the same achievement. You may think he should have done more. You may also see a frightened teenager with no clear way forward. Both thoughts can remain. Rod and Sarah found a way to speak. She found room to call him Dad. He found room to admit the word had not always felt earned. Some absences end when a person returns. Others remain in the relationship quietly, even while love grows around them. Rod Stewart has told the story with a joke. Rachel Hunter ended their relationship on a Monday evening. He said, "The shock was immediate. No one leaves Rod." It sounds like bravado, and it is, but the joke works because the opposite had happened. He had been left, and he did not know what to do with the feeling. For years, the public saw Rod as a man who always moved forward. Another photograph, another relationship, no visible wound. Rachel disturbed that story. She was 21 when they married in 1990. Rod was 45. Even then, the difference was impossible to ignore. His own sister warned him Rachel was too young, a judgment he would repeat years later with the clarity people often discover after a relationship has failed. They had 2 children, Renee and Liam. Then, in 1999, Rachel left. In 2025, Rod described the separation in words far less polished than the jokes. It tore him to shreds. That phrase matters because it arrived decades later. He did not need it to win sympathy during a fresh divorce. The legal ending had been completed years earlier. The children were adults. Both lives had moved on. Yet the memory still carried enough force that he described himself as torn apart. Rod's version contains plenty of contradiction. He admits devastation, then jokes about the months that followed. He says his sister had been right, but he ignored her. He remembers the heartbreak, then describes meeting Penny Lancaster soon afterward. Even that meeting nearly disappeared because a musician in his band refused to give him Penny's number, convinced Rod was in no condition to begin anything serious. The friend was probably right. Rod waited 6 months before contacting her. There is awkward humanity in that delay. Someone close enough saw that Rod was hurt and reckless at once, and decided another woman should not be pulled into the confusion yet. Rachel's departure was not only the end of a romance, a family divided around it. Renee and Liam had to grow through the years after the separation, while their parents found different lives. Celebrity accounts become thin there. They tell us who left and remarried, while children continue moving between adults whose choices become their environment. Rod rarely narrates that period in domestic detail. Maybe that is privacy. Still, one later image says more than a polished explanation could. In May 2024, Liam married Nicole Artukovic in Dubrovnik, Croatia. Rachel was there. Penny was there. All 8 of Rod's children were there. Former relationships, current marriage, siblings born decades apart, all gathered because one son was getting married. Look at that picture long enough, and it stops being a celebrity family photograph. It becomes evidence of labor nobody can see. Someone had to accept discomfort. Old partners stood within the same celebration. Children raised under different roofs had to regard one another as family. None of that happens automatically. The wedding did not erase the Monday Rachel left. It did not prove everyone had forgotten old pain. It showed something less dramatic. People had learned how to occupy the same day. Rod once treated being left as almost unbelievable. Beneath the humor was a man confronting a limit he had not expected. Recognition could not make another person stay. Charm could not negotiate a different stage of her life. He later credited Penny with mending his heart. Perhaps she did. But Rachel's place was not removed. She remained the mother of 2 of his children. Years later, she stood at their son's wedding beside the family that grew after her. That is not a clean ending. It is something families sometimes manage instead. A way to stop asking the past to disappear before everyone is allowed into the room. When Penny Lancaster entered Rod Stewart's life, she did not enter an empty house. 6 children already existed. Each had a mother, a private history, and an understanding of their father formed long before Penny appeared. There were loyalties nobody needed to announce, and disappointments she had not caused. Years later, Penny became emotional while explaining how slowly she approached that family. At first, she stayed in the background. She did not assume closeness because she loved their father. The bonds took time, and she admitted that some of what eventually became possible had once seemed almost impossible. That detail unsettles the easy version of their story. The easy version says, Rod finally met the right woman, settled down, and everyone formed one happy family. Real life did not fit so neatly. Penny was younger than Rod. She wanted children of her own. Rod already had 6, and initially did not want more. She later said that, had he refused completely, she would have left. Becoming a mother mattered too much to surrender. He changed his mind. Alistair was born in 2005. Aidan followed in 2011. By then, Rod's children stretched across generations. His eldest daughter was already middle-aged when his youngest son was born. The word father meant something different to each, because each had received a different man. Sarah knew the father she met as an adult. Kimberly and Sean knew the years of his first marriage. Ruby came from another relationship and another period. Renee and Liam belonged to the marriage whose end, he said, tore him apart. Alistair and Aidan received the later household with Penny. Calling them Rod Stewart's 8 children makes the structure sound simpler than it is. Penny's role could not be identical with each child, and perhaps she understood that earlier than many would. She did not try to replace their mothers. She tried to become trustworthy through repeated contact, practical help, and ordinary consistency. One family event is especially revealing. When Kimberly had difficulty producing enough milk after the birth of her daughter, Delilah, Penny had recently given birth to Aidan and provided expressed breast milk for the baby. It is an intimate, almost startling detail. A stepmother helping nourish her stepdaughter's child while caring for her own infant. No speech could manufacture that connection. It complicates the idea that Rod alone brought everyone together. Other people still had to build it. Rod has said he tries to gather his children whenever possible. By 2024, all 8 were together at Liam's wedding. From a distance, that looks natural. Up close, it represents decades of separate households. Penny described herself as remaining behind the main action until relationships developed. There is humility in that, but also wisdom. You cannot demand trust from people who have already seen adults come and go. Rod, for his part, has spoken about apologizing. He says he teaches his younger sons that a man should be able to say sorry. That lesson sounds simple until you place it beside the history. A father with 8 children cannot offer one apology and assume it reaches everyone equally. Sorry for what? For being absent? For expecting children to adapt to adult decisions? For allowing embarrassment to become a joke before anyone could name it? We do not know which conversations happened privately, and we should not invent them. But Penny's account suggests harmony was not inherited, it was negotiated. Maybe that is why family photographs mean more when you understand what they do not show. They do not show years when everyone was not ready, the careful introductions, or moments when somebody decided to try again. They show the result for one afternoon. Perhaps that is all a blended family can honestly promise at first. Not perfection, just another gathering that did not fall apart. And even that is something. Sorry. It is not a word usually associated with the younger Rod Stewart, at least not in the stories people remember. Those stories preferred confidence, appetite, impulse, the assumption that another opportunity would arrive. Now he says he teaches his sons that a real man must know how to apologize. It sounds less like a lecture than something learned through damage. Rod and Penny have said they try not to let conflict remain unresolved. They value honesty. They make up quickly. Penny has credited him with becoming more empathetic, and Rod has credited her with changing how he communicates, becoming more empathetic. That phrase is not flattering in the uncomplicated way celebrity praise usually is. It quietly acknowledges empathy was not always his strongest instinct. Charm can open a conversation. It cannot complete an apology. Humor can release tension. But it can also redirect attention before the injured person has finished speaking. Rod still jokes. He probably always will. But in his later comments about family, there are moments when the joke no longer gets the final word. Consider Sarah. He did not say reconnecting made everything right. He admitted the paternal bond had been absent because the acts of fatherhood had been absent. Consider Rachel. He did not pretend the marriage ended, because both people calmly recognized an incompatibility. He admitted she left, his sister had warned him, and the separation broke something in him. Consider Don and Bob. He did not transform their deaths into a speech about gratitude. He named them as friends who could not be replaced. These statements emerged in different years and settings. Together, they suggest Rod's silence was never total. It was selective. He spoke around difficult things, then approached them later, each time a little more directly. That is how many families tell the truth. A person says something incomplete. Years pass. A child becomes a parent and understands an old decision differently. The story changes again. You may be waiting for the moment Rod names every regret. There may never be such a moment. Would it help? Public apologies can sound brave while requiring little. Private repair asks you to hear an answer you cannot edit and remain when forgiveness does not arrive immediately. The strongest evidence of change may not be anything Rod has said. It may be that people with separate histories continue to return. Sarah developed a relationship with him. Rachel attended Liam's wedding. Penny built bonds with children who had no obligation to accept her. All 8 children gathered in Croatia. None of that proves an absence of pain. It proves pain did not prevent every future meeting. Rod is also a grandfather. His children now make decisions for children of their own. He becomes one relative among many, expected to arrive, listen, and fit into routines created by someone else. Maybe this is where the lesson about saying sorry becomes less theoretical. An apology does not return a missed birthday or altar who sat beside a child when they were frightened. It does something smaller. It tells the other person, you are no longer asking them to pretend the absence was harmless. You cannot make every adult child remember events as you remember them. You cannot ask a daughter to feel a childhood she did not have. You cannot decide an ex-wife's pain ended when yours did. You can show up. You can behave differently. You can apologize without controlling what happens next. And even that sounds too resolved. People do not become wise all at once. Rod can speak thoughtfully about apologies and still be demanding. Penny has said he requires considerable attention. He can be affectionate, difficult, generous, vain, funny, and frustrating within the same week. No final corrected version of the man. Just an old habit interrupted, now and then by a better choice. There is a photograph from Liam Stewart's wedding in Croatia that invites an easy conclusion. Rod is there. Penny is there. Rachel is there. All 8 children are there. Different branches of the family gathered around the marriage of one son. You could look at it and say everything worked out, but photographs are merciful. They do not record difficult conversations, long avoidance, or awkward first meetings. They preserve the second in which everyone faced the same direction. That is enough for a picture. It is not the entire family. At 81, Rod Stewart has become more willing to speak about experiences that do not improve his image. A marriage devastated him. Fatherhood did not automatically exist with his first child. Penny entered his earlier family cautiously. Apologizing had to be learned. When his brothers died, he sounded like the youngest sibling again. That is the silence he has been breaking. Not one hidden scandal or a single confession. Something quieter, the gradual surrender of stories that once protected him. The story that he was always the person who left. The story that biological connection automatically made him a father. The story that a new marriage could begin without inheriting old wounds. The story that a large family would naturally become close because everyone shared his name. The story that regret, once admitted, becomes repair. Sarah now calls him Dad. His children gather. Penny has remained. Grandchildren have entered the family. Former partners can share a celebration. But joy does not require us to lie about what preceded it. Sarah's adoptive parents were her parents through the years Rod missed. Rachel's marriage ended painfully even if later occasions became peaceful. Don and Bob remain absent from the first family that formed him. Penny's closeness with the older children was built, not granted. Each present-day image rests beside a past that cannot be rearranged. His later admissions do not reveal one secret. They weaken a persona piece by piece. He was not untouched when Rachel left. He was not automatically Dad when Sarah returned. He was not able to keep his first family unchanged. He was not the only person required to forgive. There is courage in admitting those things, and perhaps comfort for the person carrying regret. Both can be true. Maybe Sarah needed him to acknowledge what had been absent. Maybe his younger sons need to hear that apology is not weakness. Maybe Penny needed the older children to see she would not force her way into their history. Maybe Rod needed to understand that being loved by many people does not mean loving each person well. I keep returning to the wedding photograph because it contains success and failure at once. A family created through love, separation, endurance, and second attempts. There are 8 children, but more than 8 versions of Rod. Each encountered him at a different age. Former partners remember different households. His siblings knew a boy his children never met. Which version is real? The answer may depend on who is speaking. Sarah's Rod is not Rachel's. Penny's is not Bob's. None of them owns the whole man. Probably all of them. That is less satisfying than discovering a secret, but closer to how a life feels from inside it. Perhaps Rod has finally broken his silence. Or perhaps he has only stopped interrupting certain truths with a joke. There may be apologies accepted but not forgotten, questions Sarah no longer needs answered, and things Rachel understands differently. A family can gather without agreeing on the past. A father can be loved without having been present enough. A man can change without becoming innocent, and the question that remains is not whether Rod Stewart finally told the truth. It is whether the people closest to him felt heard when he did.